So we've talked about cells in a previous video. We've talked about all of the components that make cells work, the membranes, their organelles. We've talked about the metabolism, how cells get energy, how they make their components. Now it's time to move up to the next level of organization. And above cells, that is tissues. All right? Tissues are multiple cells, sometimes multiple different cell types, working together to create a multi-celled, often three-dimensional environment, cooperating together to achieve some sort of goal. And in the body, there are 4 tissue types, each of which has its own characteristics. Now, within those broad categories of tissue types, there are subtypes that I will talk about in a future lecture for each of them. But for right now, for this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview and introduction to each of the 4 tissue types. What tissues are is multiple cells working together for a common purpose. The cells are usually similar, not always identical. Sometimes they're identical. And usually the cells will have a similar origin, right? So when animals are developing, we all develop from a single fertilized egg. And the first cell types to arise are what are called embryonic stem cells. Embryonic stem cells can turn into any other type of cell. But fairly early on in development, the embryonic stem cells begin to differentiate down one of 3 paths. What's called the endoderm, the exoderm, and the mesoderm. And you don't need to memorize those. We'll talk about them more if we talk about human development, probably in the second semester. But what you need to know is that there are like several steps that goes in between going from a embryonic stem cell to like a final finished adult cells. And most of the cells that make up a tissue will come from, they'll walk together down that path for a while before they diverge. The study of tissues is called histology. And it's something that we'll be doing quite a lot of in lab. The 4 types of tissues, the first of them is what is called epithelial tissue. Epi means on top. These are cells that make linings. Pretty much every lining in your body is made of these. Anytime you have an organ, it will be lined with epithelial tissue. Your body, your skin, its upper lining is epithelial tissue. Anything that faces an open space, or at least just a non-tissue space, is lined with epithelial tissue. So you've got epithelial tissue lining your skin, lining the insides of your intestines, lining the outsides of your intestines, lining the insides of all of your blood vessels, lining the insides of your lungs, the insides of your kidneys, anywhere where there's a tube or a space, epithelial tissue is what lines it. And it is pretty much always found on top, right? Facing that space. So you will always see epithelial tissue at the top of something. So like, let's say you have let's say you have a tube. Maybe it's a blood vessel, maybe it's a chunk of intestine or something like that, right? And then the lining that faces the open area will be made out of epithelial tissue. So the cells that are making up this lining is epithelial. And sometimes you might have multiple cell layers of epithelial tissue. You see that in your skin. But the epithelial lining will always face this open area. There are many shapes and sizes of epithelial cells, which we'll talk about later on. But epithelial tissue is almost always found in layers of tightly packed cells, where you have cell next to cell, next to cell, next to cell, next to cell, next to cell. And then, cells are always touching cells. They don't have a lot of open space around them. Since epithelial tissues are always found anywhere there's a surface in the body, whether that surface is internal or external, any communication with areas that are not tissue, that are not cell-based, are done by the epithelial layer. So pretty much all of your body's absorption and secretion is handled by epithelial tissue. Second type of tissue is connective tissue. Connective tissue is actually mostly not cells. It's the most abundant type of tissue in the body. By mass, more of the body is connective tissue than anything else. Connective tissue actually does not contain densely packed cells. It has a big network of fibers, mostly protein fibers, that have cells sort of dispersed throughout them. And this network of fibers is called the extracellular matrix, or ECM. And you'll see basically this web of fibers. Sometimes the fibers all go the same direction. Sometimes they're just going to head off random directions. And then in this fiber, you'll see some cells. They're sort of dispersed around usually. But they aren't going to be right up next to each other. You seldom see cells actually touching each other in the extracellular matrix. Usually connective tissue it connects things. Often it will connect the epithelial tissue with the deeper tissue, but basically anywhere that there's a space that isn't supposed to be empty, but doesn't have anything particular in it, you'll have connective tissue filling that space. It provides strength, support, protection, and shape and structure to the body. There are many different types of connective tissue, which we will talk about in future videos, but the main types of cells that you will see in connective tissue are fibroblasts, which is actually the most abundant cell type in the body. These are the cells that actually lay down all of these cables. They make the extracellular matrix. Adipose or fat cells, which can be found in connective tissue. Blood is a type of connective tissue. Bone cells are called osteocytes. There are a few different types of them. Cartilage and others. The connective tissue is often very vascularized, so it provides basically space where blood and nerves and lymphatic vessels and anything like that can travel through. So it's got a lot of stuff moving through it. Here you can see this is connective tissue. You see these dark spots there? Each of those is the nuclei of a cell, and you can see that they aren't right next to each other. Here we've got a cell, here we've got a cell, here we've got a cell. All this pink stuff in between is these fibers, these usually collagen, but these proteinish fibers stretching back and forth. And you can see there's actually some epithelial tissue here. Remember, epithelial tissue is always found facing an open space, lining things. And so you see that there is a single layer of epithelial tissue here and a single layer of epithelial tissue here. Our third cell type, tissue type, is muscle tissue. Muscle tissue will be discussed extensively in the section on muscles, which will be our third section in the course. And it consists of long strands of muscle cells. Sometimes you'll have like individual fusiform cells that link together and would be called smooth muscle. Sometimes you'll have just long fibrous cells that have multiple nuclei. In any case, muscle cells are always excitable, meaning if you deliver an electrical shock or a change in the electromagnetic field, they will conduct that signal down themselves. And muscle cells provide contractile force. Our third type of cell is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue has two different cell types. Neurons, which are sort of the stars of nervous tissue. They're the ones that actually conduct signals. They are also excitable. They're what we would call a nerve, although nerves are actually larger structures. The other type of nervous tissue is called neuroglia. These are the support staff, right? For every one star, there's got to be like 10 people who are making sure that that star can do their job. These are the ones, like, they make sure that the neurons are headed the right way. They protect the neurons, eating anything that might want to, like, interfere with them or infect them. They provide nutrients and protection, like physical protection, cushioning, and they enhance their conductive properties so that the neurons can work properly. There's far more neuroglia in your body than there are neurons, at least by cell number, but the neurons kind of, they're the stars of the show. They're the ones everyone knows. Primarily, the function of nervous tissue is to send and receive signals. They conduct information throughout the body, and primarily they are involved in stimulating muscle cells and glandular cells in the peripheral nervous system, though they also process information in the central nervous system. Bullet points for this lecture: you should know what a tissue is. You should know the 4 types of tissues, and you should know generally the function of each tissue